Welcome to the Shift Report, the podcast from MCentric and the MCentric Foundation. MCentric is the go-to information and resources hub designed exclusively for the emergency medicine community. We regularly host key leaders from the field who share their insights and experience. Our goal is to inform our listeners and to encourage you to use what you learn to improve your practice and improve yourself. To learn more, please visit us at mcentric.org. Today, we welcome Larissa May. Dr. May practices in California. She received her medical degree from the George Washington University and also trained in emergency medicine at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Today, we'll discuss the important work Dr. May has done in the area of antibiotic stewardship, along with her insights on career development and growth, including areas of entrepreneurship and technology. Welcome, Larissa.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thanks for taking the time to share some insights with us and chat with us today. We appreciate it. You've got a wide range of experience. You've started out in the Washington, D.C. area and migrated to California and have done a collection of things. How did you end up in emergency medicine? What led you to the field?
You know, it's really interesting. When I was a medical student at GW in the late 90s and early 2000s, I really became fascinated by the coursework we did in microbiology, and I really thought I wanted to be an infectious diseases physician. So I actually started off in internal medicine. And within, I would say 3 months of starting that program at GW in primary care, some of my friends were telling me, we don't understand why you went into that. This doesn't really seem to suit your personality. Now, this was before the electronic health record, so there was a lot of patient follow-up, a lot of chronic disease management, and it was kind of slow-paced. So I would get bored on rounds because my most favorite thing was the differential diagnosis. And after that, I would not really have the level of detailed interest in order to really take care of patients continuously for long periods of time. I did my rotation in the emergency department in November. Now, I had done a rotation in medical school. We were all required to, and I really enjoyed it. And loved the faculty, loved the environment. But, you know, I liked everything in everything, not just emergency medicine. And so maybe that was telling then. So I basically did my rotation in November, and I fell so in love with emergency medicine that I decided to quit my internal medicine residency. Of course, I had finished out my internal medicine year, but I so knew I didn't want to come back to internal medicine that I was willing to take a gap year. Luckily for me, even though I started to go through the match process again, a spot opened up at GW. And so I just kind of slid in back when emergency medicine programs had, some of us had the option of the 234 program. I miss those days.
Yeah, so that's a great story. Everybody's kind of come to this in different ways. And I think part of our mentoring of students and residents is that there is a conventional way, and most people actually don't follow it. They follow something else. And that's, as you hear these stories, you get that impression. Now, you went through training and went into an academic position and over time developed an expertise that I think flows from that initial infectious disease insight into antibiotic stewardship, which is an important area for, you know, we're almost in two sides of this in emergency medicine where we sometimes complain about various of our colleagues and other specialties giving antibiotics to everyone for everything, but also being pressured to give antibiotics quickly because of the justifiable focus on sepsis. So how do you reconcile all that, and what brought you to that, and tell us a bit about how we can be better at antibiotic stewardship?
Yeah, so I think my interest in antibiotics stewardship really stemmed from my clinical experience in the emergency department of seeing so many patients with undifferentiated infections or even infections that didn't need antibiotics, getting antibiotics prescribed. And as a colleague in antibiotic stewardship told me, the next frontier in stewardship is going to be in the emergency department. And so I really was at the forefront of that back in 2010, 2011. My main focus at that time was diagnostic testing to try to improve or reduce antibiotic prescriptions in patients with cutaneous abscesses, of which, as you recall, we were seeing a lot. So that was sort of my first foray into it, and wrote a concept paper with some colleagues that was published in the Annals of Emergency Medicine on why we should be focusing on antibiotic stewardship and why it's important to emergency medicine. So that's how I got there. I think there is now a much greater interest in stewardship from CMS, from other federal agencies, from the states, because this is a patient safety issue. So antibiotic stewardship is optimizing antibiotics. So I want to clarify that misconception. It's not never prescribe an antibiotic. And there are many situations in the ED where we see a spectrum of infections ranging from like benign upper respiratory tract infections all the way to severe life-threatening sepsis that in many cases it is appropriate to start broad spectrum antibiotics. And sometimes in that case, stewardship means starting the broad spectrum antibiotic and also obtaining the appropriate diagnostic testing like the cultures. So antibiotic stewardship isn't about not prescribing antibiotics. It's about using them wisely.
That those are great insights. I think that at the bedside, we are faced with decisions and pressures, frankly, and thoughts from others. And there is an inclination to be very broad. And there are also demands from patients with the more minor illnesses who want things. How do we deal with particularly at the level of the patient who thinks you're doing nothing because you're not giving antibiotics?
Well, I think most physicians at least know that they really shouldn't be prescribing antibiotics, at least from an evidence-based perspective for conditions like acute bronchitis. I do think we've done some qualitative research looking at the reasons why, even though we know this, we may prescribe, and we're all guilty of it in some way. I think those reasons, can be just habit. So training under someone who prescribed a Z-Pak for every patient with a respiratory infection, but it could also be concern for poor outcomes. And we tend to feel that if we prescribe the antibiotic, the outcome's going to be better than if we don't prescribe the antibiotic when it's needed, even though that's really not true because there can be potential adverse events from using antibiotics that are not needed. I think also we don't have access to great diagnostic testing to tell us whether a patient has a viral or bacterial infection, or, we certainly don't have direct from blood yet identification of pathogens and antibiotic susceptibilities. So that's a limitation. We often have to work in a quick paced environment with lots of different providers working different shifts with different practices. So it can be quite challenging. Sometimes we're under pressure from our specialty colleagues to prescribe antibiotics for patients that they're consulting on or admitting. So I think that's one of the those are some of the challenges that we face in antibiotic stewardship. I'm going to stop here because now I lost sight of the question. What was the
No, no,
original question?
those are great insights. I mean, this is a tough area that continues to evolve, and I don't think anybody knows what the future looks like as far as newer, broader antibiotics. We keep hearing news of, the next whatever the next generation is, and when at a time when maybe antibiotics won't be useful at all for certain things, and we're already seeing some of that in some conditions now. So I think there's a future ahead for this. You have now, as one peruses your professional history through a CV or LinkedIn or however one does that, you've developed a broader interest in that time since 2010, 2011 to include this, also likely consulting during COVID, based on your expertise in infectious diseases, and also in broader entrepreneurial areas. So for those that are interested in how to turn a clinical practice into advising, consulting, or otherwise, how have you gone about that? And perhaps without naming names, tell us what you do for your clients.
Yeah, so I think I actually credit the GW Emergency Medicine residency with a lot of how my career path has unfolded, which has not been a traditional path for sure. But we had the opportunity in our senior year, in our fourth year of emergency medicine residency, to develop a niche. And we were encouraged to do that. We actually got protected time. So we worked fewer shifts for picking an area that we were interested in. And GW was pretty forward thinking in that it didn't have to be a research project or scholarly work. I had colleagues do medical journalism, global health, and other things, but I chose to focus on infectious diseases. And so developing curricula on emerging infectious diseases, spending some time in our local public health department. And I think that really made it really interesting for me and positioned me quite well because I was working in a selected space that a lot of emergency medicine physicians were not as interested in. And it was, clearly a field that was going to continue to have a need. So I remember when I had my first job interview with my first chair, And he said, "How on earth are you going to create a career out of emerging infectious diseases?" So this was right after SARS one. And I thought, well, I don't know, but I'm really interested in this topic, and it seems like there are going to be a lot more opportunities. And sure enough, I did once I became more interested in clinical research, started getting some publications out there in antibiotic stewardship and diagnostics. Attending conferences and networking was really important to me. I really had some mentors that encouraged me to do that. I happen to be an extrovert, so I really liked that external facing role and meeting new people and just this curiosity of learning what others are doing. And through some of those conferences, I actually met some potential industry collaborators and people that were interested in what I was thinking about antibiotic stewardship, about diagnostics development. And that's how it started. And obviously during COVID, my career just sort of catapulted because of my areas of expertise in contagious disease outbreak preparedness, diagnostic devices, et cetera. So it was really quite unusual, I think, because while most people were sort of their research had stalled or they weren't able to go out and continue to do the things they were interested in. In my case, I had a number of interesting opportunities, both in terms of consulting for diagnostic companies, as well as some high level leadership opportunities in public health.
So part of the beginnings of MCentric are focused around networking within emergency medicine, whether it be physicians, nurse practitioners, PAs, residents, nurses, and the like. You speak of a broader area of networking at a very practical level. How does one go about doing that? Is it as simple as accepting coffee invitations and going to conferences you wouldn't normally go to, or is it something more exotic than that?
Well, I think back in those days, LinkedIn wasn't a thing. I think now it's a lot easier to connect with people online, to build your networks that way, and have a presence online. When I started doing this, it really was based on my interest in infectious diseases, and I felt that it was sometimes better in terms of networking to be the one expert in emergency medicine in a different specialty, like infectious diseases. So that actually afforded a lot of opportunities that maybe some of my colleagues, who are more interested in more traditional emergency medicine research and, were networking within the emergency medicine societies. Not that that's, I mean, that can be very valuable as well. And there've been a number of research networks created that way. But for me, I really was always the one outsider in another specialty, which was infectious diseases. And so my expertise in emergency medicine was valuable, and I provided a connection between those two groups, which only strengthened as time went on. So I think finding your niche first is really how you can create that longevity in emergency medicine. And then if you're interested in consulting opportunities or research opportunities or speaking opportunities, like advisory boards, that started for me pretty early, is really related to your ability to network and think outside the box and maybe go to some of those conferences and be that one emergency physician at that conference. So there were a number of conferences early on. Some of them were public health conferences. I belonged to a society called the International Society for Disease Surveillance that one of my public health mentors introduced me to. And I think I was the only emergency medicine physician there, although there were a couple of emergency physicians who worked for some of the big consulting firms or worked for government who were there as well. But I was definitely the only practicing emergency physician. And so that was an interesting perspective. Ultimately, I continued having opportunities in public health, but never really leveraged any real research grants or anything from that experience. But it did teach me a lot about other people's perspectives and speaking others' languages. I think uh, later on when I decided to do my executive MBA, I really wanted to speak the language of the industry folks that I was collaborating with, but also, frankly, just to be able to put a business proposal together for my antibiotic stewardship program when I had administrators in the health system, who understood terms like ROI and who, had to lead the budgets. And so I learned a lot about budget management and pitching back then. And during that whole time of, talking to and working with industry collaborators, either as an investigator who was developing protocols for grant funding or conducting FDA registrational trials as a site principal investigator, I think I also kind of got that sort of bug from consulting to actually hear what people were kind of working on at the very early stages. So, for example, one of the consulting gigs I had was what you can basically say was the M&A arm of a large diagnostics company. And my goal was to evaluate new technology, not from the standpoint of the tech itself, but from the clinical gaps and needs and potential market. And so I learned a lot from those experiences. And of course, I then ventured a little bit into the startup community and met some really great, really brilliant people that really got me interested in innovation and entrepreneurship.
So for those without a business background or without an MBA, you mentioned M&A, which is mergers and acquisitions, which
Yes.
sounds very much Wall Streety. So how do you navigate your way through that sort of world, which is finance, venture capital, and others? I'm sure your MBA helps, and your experience helps. Sort of how does one navigate that world and prove your relevance and value?
I think the MBA helped, but I don't think it's necessary. I felt that it was valuable to me because I really needed a structured way to learn a lot of the information, like accounting and finance, that was very, in my opinion, dry. And I really needed that structure, but I don't think it's necessary. And there are a number of, organizations now, perhaps, of the Society of Physician Entrepreneurs, started by Arlen Myers, who's quite active. He was actually my MBA professor, taught an entrepreneurship class at the University of Colorado, Denver when I was there. And so that also piqued my interest. And so I just got to be connected with a number of physicians and scientists that really have interest in solving problems, but outside the box, outside the healthcare organization or outside of industry, with their own intellectual property. And so I got so interested in this area and luckily had the support of my chair that I wrote myself a new job description. So I was the director of emergency department antibiotic stewardship at UC Davis Health, and then became the director of innovation and external partnerships in the emergency department. And at the same time, took a sabbatical during calendar year 2023 to finish my MBA and also really focus on learning from health ventures. And joined the Berkeley Skydeck at that time, which is an accelerator at UC Berkeley that helps support a number of successful startups. And so I really got into that space. And I find it fascinating because, like I said, I think some of the most brilliant self-starter, out-of-the-box thinkers are those entrepreneurs.
This is a great story. And as I think through this, as many of our listeners know, and I believe you know, there's a significant wellness and burnout problem within emergency medicine. At Mcentric, we are partnering with our not-for-profit arm, the Mcentric Foundation, to try to apply best practices, learning models, resources to developing wellness upstream in our resident population and others. As I hear you talk about what you're doing, I hear an excitement in your voice and an interest level in your voice about the things you're doing. You practice clinically and are quite skilled at it, but have found other things that also seem to excite you. How does that play into your professional and personal growth?
Well, like I said, I think in order to have longevity in the career of emergency medicine, particularly now where the clinical work is so hard with the workforce shortages and the acuity of the patients that we're seeing and closures of hospitals, lack of access to primary care. I have found that some of the non-clinical interests I have, or the interest actually, they're not non-clinical, in solving some of the problems we face in emergency care has given me renewed energy and passion. Sometimes that passion isn't always valued in certain settings, but I think, more and more of us are wanting to make a change, to be the difference. And so I find that, focusing, for example, on the opportunities to improve diagnosis in the emergency department, um, to address some of the systems issues that we're having, can both improve patient outcomes, but also the physician experience, which is so critical now. And, hopefully in the future, because we're just starting to lose a lot of our really talented workforce, and the pipeline is definitely slowing. And it takes many, many years to grow a physician. And it saddens me to hear that so many medical students are considering not even ever seeing patients in their future. So I think we have a role, as perhaps a more senior generation to inspire and motivate the generation behind, but also to try to fix those systems that are leading to the burnout. Because I think the idea, of more yoga classes or, resiliency training suggests that it's a problem with the individual. But the reality is our systems are not supportive of providing patient care. It's almost like the incentives and the processes are misaligned with what's really needed to provide high value quality care.
Those are important insights from a perspective of years of navigating yourself, sometimes with mentors and sometimes on your own. If you have, as closing thoughts, if you have a student or a resident in front of you who's, looking at sort of the mission of emergency medicine, but concerned about what he or she sees in our colleagues, what are a few things you might tell them?
Well, first off, I really think it's important to mentor the next generation. That's been, I think, one of the, not the only reason, but one of the reasons I've stayed in academia so long is the ability to mentor and inspire that next generation. In fact, I always say mentorship is leadership. So I've learned much in the way of leadership skills from my mentors, but also as much from my mentees. And I think we need to be good role models for them, but we also need to be transparent and honest about what the weaknesses and challenges are in our healthcare system. Rather than just telling people to work harder, work harder, work harder with less and less, acknowledging that this system is difficult to sustain. And we all need to find ways, to acknowledge our humanity, to be able to admit we made a mistake, to fail hard and fast, not the same specialty it was in the past. I had a colleague early on when I was here at UC Davis who really felt that emergency medicine should be all about resuscitation. But we know that's not emergency care today, that people seek us not just for convenience, but because they don't have access that's timely. It's very hard to get a diagnostic workup outside of our setting. And so we are providing this amazing service and need to really focus on those patient outcomes. So I think we are the safety net, and embracing that really is necessary. It does require, a lot of thought because we're not necessarily trained to do all these things, right? We are not trained in the business of medicine. We're not well trained in public health. We don't understand the insurance system. I mean, until I did my MBA, I really didn't understand really the payer system in the United States and how it operates. But it's absolutely critical for physician leaders to understand that, including in emergency medicine, because value-based care is here to stay. And even though most of our organizations are currently fee for service, I think this is going to change. We're going to be expected to show outcomes, and we're going to have to work with healthcare administrators, and we're going to need more physicians in administrative leadership. It's not the dark side. It's understanding what patient care is and understanding what's needed, and then working to make that change.
This has been a wonderful conversation, and I very much appreciate you sharing sort of the story of going from internal medicine intern to emergency physician to expert in a clinical area, and to really then broaden things to success and entrepreneurship and then guidance of others, which I think we would all agree is important as we develop the next generation. So, Dr. May, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us in this installment of our M-Centric podcast series, The Shift Report. And special thanks to Dr. May for sharing her important insights.